Hello my friend, thank you very much for watching. I'm Michael, and for the last 2 months I have been using the Nikon Z6 for my wildlife photography. And today I would like to do just a short video to talk about my initial experience with the camera and what I see as the main strengths and weaknesses after having used it in the field quite a bit. I'll go through the strengths, then the weaknesses, and then I'll talk a little bit about what situations I prefer to use this over the D850 and which situations where I prefer to use the D850 over the Z6. But just before we get into the strength, I want to mention that I bought this recently, so I've been using it exclusively with firmware update 3. And as far as I can understand, firmware update 3 took care of a lot of issues that people were experiencing with the first 2 versions of the firmware, especially when it comes to autofocus. And I believe that some of the initial quite negative reviews of the Z6, especially for wildlife photography, were based on the shortcomings of firmware version 1. I updated to firmware version 3 right away, and that's what I've been using with this camera. Okay, now we got that cleared up, let's jump in and talk about some of the strengths of this awesome little mirrorless camera. One of the main reasons why I bought this camera and why I was curious to try it was its low light performance. I was comparing it to a couple of different DSLRs in cameradecision.com, and the specs, I mean, on paper, this thing beat all of them basically. Even Nikon D5, the low light performance of the little Z6 was superior on paper. And I thought that was quite interesting because there's a big price difference between this one and the D5. And I was even considering buying a D5 just to get better low light performance. I am pretty picky when it comes to keeping, images low noise and getting the right exposure and stuff like that. So I'm constantly, trying to get better low light performance. And the Z6 did not disappoint. I am very, very impressed, and it is definitely a lot better than what I've gotten with any DSLR camera before. I mean, I would say even with the D850, which was an improvement over the D500, even with the D850, I was still not quite satisfied, and I probably wouldn't go over ISO 1000 or 1500 normally. With this camera, I have images I've shot at 3000 plus that I'm really happy with and just look beautiful. And the same goes for low light video. So when it comes to low light, man, I'm just so impressed with this little camera. The second big strength I see with this camera, and one of the second reason why I was curious to try it out, is because of its video capabilities, its video performance. Because that's one thing that was driving me absolutely nuts with the D850. Video autofocus on the D850 is so bad. It's so bad. And I do quite a lot of video. I was really getting annoyed. I mean, if you don't have to autofocus at all, if you can basically just put the camera in one place and record something static sitting there like an owl, well then it's fine. But as soon as you're trying to track something that moves, it's horrible. So it's actually, most of the videos I've done with the D850, you can hear me in the background like cussing and swearing up a storm, just getting really, really frustrated and angry. Not with the Z6. It is just amazing. I mean, it's so good. The autofocus for video is just incredible. So it's just a delight to use. And one thing that's a huge difference from the DSLR is the fact that you can actually do video through the electronic viewfinder here. So you can actually hold it up to your eye and you can track stuff and you can pan and so on. It just works great. And that's one thing that's, to me, incredibly awkward with the DSLRs, is you're using live view in the back there, and that just makes it even harder to focus. So for video, I love this camera so much. It's very impressive to me anyways. So another thing that was kind of a surprise that I really hadn't thought about, but which is actually kind of a game changer for me, and yeah, just an added benefit that I didn't realize till I started using it, is the fact that because of the electronic viewfinder, you get the true exposure. That's what you're seeing in the viewfinder. You know exactly what your image is going to look like. And as I mentioned before, I'm pretty fanatic about getting the right exposure dialed in. And with a DSLR, you know, you can't see the true exposure. It's basically just a hole. The viewfinder is a hole through the camera, basically. So I spent so much time, you know, going back and forth and checking, is everything right, is everything right? And you spend a lot of time doing that. And also might be a situation where I'm shooting something over here and I have the perfect settings, and then I shoot something over here and it's, you know, blown out, overexposed or underexposed. And that's annoying, especially if you don't have time to check it. You know, you come home with your photos, you're so excited, and you realize that half of them were you know, poorly exposed. That's very frustrating. It doesn't really happen with the Z6 because I know what my exposure is right there in the viewfinder. So I can dial it in very, very precisely. And also if I see it's completely blown out, then I can make adjustments. You can even see the histogram right in the viewfinder. So that's, to me, a big, big strength of this little mirrorless camera here. And then another one that was a little bit of a surprise, which I think might not matter to, I think there's a lot of photographers that don't care about this feature, which is silent shutter, the true silent shutter on this thing here. But I do a lot of, I guess I'd call it stealth photography. I've been photographing a lot of very skittish species where, you know, you just have to be covered in camouflage. You can't make a sound, you can't move, otherwise the subject is just gone. For example, Belted Kingfishers. I've more or less exclusively been shooting them for the last couple of months and for the time where I've been shooting with the Z6. And like, they're incredibly skittish and they're virtually impossible to approach. So the only way to really get close-up portraits of them is to find out what their preferred perches are, show up before the bird does, cover up in camouflage, sit absolutely still and absolutely silent. That's, in my experience, the only way to do it. And even just the shutter sound of a DSLR camera is enough to scare the bird away, and then it won't come back. So what I was doing with the D850 was I was using live view, locking the mirror, and then pressing on the back of the live view to take the photos. But I don't like doing that. It's very inaccurate. You don't really know what you're doing. But that was the only way I can make it work. But with this true silent shutter on the Z6, it's just amazing because I can do bursts. I can do anything I want, basically, and the bird can't hear it. So that was a true game changer in the sense that normally if I was doing a burst, I would have one burst and then the bird was gone, or I would do the awkward thing with the live view on the back. But with the Z6, I could just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot, and I could have the Kingfisher sitting there for 40 minutes and it had no clue I was there. I was very, very awesome. And then the last strength I want to mention that kind of stands out to me is just the compact size, which is great. So it's awesome. It weighs very little, especially compared to the D850 where I have the battery grip and the big battery. This thing is so light. So for hiking, for awkward stuff where you have to be able to move around, be light on your feet, for travel, this thing is amazing, especially if you pair it with a tiny lens like the Nikon 500mm PF. You got such an amazing portable little setup. So that's another thing I really like about this camera. Okay, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. And we might as well talk about size right away, because while that is a strength, I also kind of see it as a weakness in the sense that it's quite a small camera. And I have big hands. I'm a tall guy, so it feels very flimsy and small, which it's hard for me to get used to. So I actually did buy the grip for it, which I think I'm happy I did, because it to me anyways, just makes it more manageable and just, feels better in your hands. And also because of the small size, when I was using it on my gimbal head with the big 500mm f4 prime, it was balanced very, very poorly because it was so front heavy. So I couldn't really use the gimbal properly. Now that I got the grip with the 2 batteries in there, it weighs a bit more and it balances perfectly, basically. The grip takes 2 batteries, and one cool thing that I really like about this grip is the fact that you can actually put and you can use a USB charger and charge both batteries at the same time. So that's pretty awesome. Quick side note on the grip here is it doesn't have any controls, which is a bit weird. I'm used to that from the DSLRs. On the other hand, it's smaller, so it's not quite as awkward to handle in portrait mode, but that seems a bit weird to me anyways. Okay, another weakness I would say with this camera here is, the battery life, and we kind of touched upon that right now. Is one of the reasons why I do think that the grip can be a good idea, is you can double up, because it only lasts for like, I think 330 something shots, which is very little compared to what I'm used to, especially because I'm rocking the D850 with the big ENL 18 batteries. This one takes the small 15s, I believe they're called. I haven't been using them for a long time, so it drains the battery really quickly, especially if you're doing a video. There is kind of a standby thing on there, so you can time it to kind of shut itself off, which saves a lot of battery life. But the problem there is then you have to basically wake up the camera. You have to wake up the electronic viewfinder. That takes a second, so that's kind of annoying. So battery life, I'd say, is a bit of an issue. So I've bought some extra of the small batteries and the grip to compensate for that fact. And then the big one that a lot of people have been talking about that I don't think is as bad as a lot of people make it out to, but it's definitely not as good as the D850's capacities, and that is autofocus for fast moving subjects, for fast action. I haven't done a ton of fast action, I have to admit, after I bought this camera, because I've mainly been shooting the Kingfishers in stealth mode, like I said. But I mean, in general, with autofocus, I really haven't had any issues, and the bit of fast action I've been doing, it wasn't a disaster, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't as good as the D850, but also it wasn't something where I was like getting really frustrated or angry. I think the thing I noticed is that you have to get used to the fact that it's an electronic viewfinder, so there's a bit of a lag. It gets a bit kind of jittery when you're like, for example, shooting a bird in flight, which is a bit weird. So it kind of feels a little bit more like spray and pray than it would with the D850, for example. I'm curious to see what they'll do with the next update, but I will say that I do, for fast action, I would probably still use the D850. And then one more thing, which is, I don't know if I'd even really call it a weakness. It's just because I've gotten used to the huge 46 megapixel files from the D850. So going down to 25 megapixels feels like, they're a lot smaller to me. And if you're used to, the D500 or the D5 or something like that, you really won't really notice it. I'm just used to having huge files where you can kind of crop quite a bit. So that's, for me, just kind of a bit of weakness. And then you could say, why didn't you get the Z7? Well, the Z7 is a lot more expensive, and then you get the big files, but then you don't get the same low light performance and so on. So depending on what you're used to, that could be considered a weakness. Okay, as I mentioned, I was going to talk a little bit about which situations where I use the Z6 over the D850 and the situations where I want to use the D850 over the Z6. Z6, low light, obviously, yes, totally. Any day I'd use that over the D5. So for example, if I'm in the dark woods photographing owls, this guy. Anything that has to do with video, 100% the Z6. I hate doing video with the D850. And also, if I have to be light on my feet, this guy's awesome. And for, like I mentioned, stealth photography, where it's important that you're completely silent, yes, Z6. D850, I still prefer that for birds in flight and fast action and so on. Yes, I would. It might change with a new firmware update and if I get more used to this one, but as of now, I do prefer the D850 for that. And then going back to the file size, if I'm shooting something that's a bit further away where I know I'm going to be cropping more, I go with the D850 because then you have, a 46 megapixel image rather than 25 megapixel image, and that just gives you more room to crop and still have a high quality image. And just kind of rounding off, one thing I'd like to mention that I think is important to kind of consider, I guess, in general with cameras is, to my knowledge and in my experience, we still do not have the ultimate perfect wildlife camera that can do everything, that can excel at every single aspect. And so I think maybe it's a little bit naive, or maybe wanting a little too much, or judging the camera a bit too hard if it can't do everything perfectly. And to me, I'm fine with that, and that's why I feel like the combination of the D850 and the Nikon Z6 here, for me, just covers everything. It just, gives me the ultimate combo here. I'm obviously hoping that one day it'll all be in one camera, but right now, for me, using those two cameras has got me covered. All right, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to write a comment and I'll get back to you as quickly as possible. And if you enjoyed the video, then please consider subscribing to my channel and turning on the alerts so you know when I put out my next video. Thank you again and have a great day.